So anyone who's been following President Trump and his promises probably woke up to some pretty significant news this morning. I mean, we're expecting an executive order today that could really get the ball rolling on dismantling the entire Department of Education.
Yeah, this is big.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive. You sent over that Fox News report, and it's got a ton of stuff in there that we're going to try to sort through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here, and really our goal is to help you understand what's actually going on here. What does it really mean for, for folks like us, for students, for teachers? What does it actually mean without getting too bogged down in all the back and forth and the political stuff?
Exactly. We're going to be focusing on what is in this executive order.
Yeah.
What are the hurdles that are standing in the way? And also, what does this actually mean, down the line? How is this going to affect things in the future?
Okay, so let's just jump right in. The executive order we're expecting today. The report says, yeah, it's definitely aimed at basically shutting down the entire U.S. Department of Education. That's the goal. And, this is a big campaign promise that he made. And so it's a pretty significant move, in terms of just campaign promises being fulfilled. And it's not something that people are just letting happen quietly. There are reports of protests already happening outside the Department of Education.
Oh, wow.
So there are people who are very upset about this.
So it's clearly something that people feel strongly about.
Yeah.
And, one thing I think that's worth pointing out is that this isn't really a surprise, sudden decision. Even when President Trump nominated Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education, the idea was that she was going to be kind of overseeing, winding down the department. The article actually talks about this.
Oh, interesting.
So in a way, this executive order is kind of like a formality in something that's been going on for a while. It wasn't like we were trying to build up the department with a new Secretary of Education. It was always kind of geared towards...
Yeah, it's okay, we have a new person here.
Right.
But the goal is to...
The goal is to scale down.
Shrink it. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Okay, so... we know what the president's thinking because the report actually has a quote from him where he calls the Department of Education a big con job. That's a pretty strong statement.
Wow.
And his goal here, which is laid out in the report, is to basically shift the balance of power in education more towards individual states so that states have more control over their school systems. It's this fundamental disagreement about what the federal government's role in education should actually be.
That makes sense. So he's got this idea, right?
Yeah.
But as you're probably already thinking, he can't just decide this, and it happens. And this is where Congress becomes really important. The report reminds us that it was actually Congress that created the Department of Education in the first place.
Right.
So that's a really key point here. And the report also mentions that Democrats have already said that they're completely against getting rid of the department.
Yeah.
There's this quote in the report that I thought was really interesting. It says, "Nobody in America wants the destruction of public education."
It's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, so it seems like there's going to be a lot of pushback against this idea.
Absolutely. And that's where we get into the nitty-gritty of how our government actually works, because the report makes it clear that just because the president signs an executive order, it doesn't mean that a federal department just disappears.
Right.
There's a whole process. It actually would require an act of Congress, and it would probably need a supermajority, 60 votes in the Senate.
Right.
And given, where things are politically right now, and with the Democrats saying they're completely opposed, the report's pretty clear. It says there is no talk in Congress at all about shuttering the Department of Education. So it doesn't sound like that's going to happen anytime soon.
That's interesting. So then that really begs the question.
Yeah.
What can this executive order actually accomplish?
Yeah.
If Congress is unlikely to just completely dissolve the Department of Education, what's the point of all this?
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Because the report kind of hints that what we might see is what they're calling a shutdown, perhaps in name only.
Okay.
So it might not actually go away completely, but it's going to look really different.
I see.
They're talking about the core functions of the Department of Education, the things that actually affect students and schools directly.
Right, like student loans?
Exactly, like federal student loans, different programs that are run through the Department of Education for schools. Those things probably aren't going to just stop. But they might be moved around. The report mentions the possibility of shifting these functions to other federal agencies that already exist. But the point is that without Congress officially getting rid of it, the Department of Education as a legal entity will probably still be there, just maybe without
much power.
Right, without much power, without much to do. It's like taking the engine out of a car but leaving the frame of the car still there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great analogy.
It's a shell of what it used to be.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so.
And it's also important to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. The report talks about this move as part of a larger effort by this group called the Department of Government Efficiency.
Oh, right.
And they're trying to cut back spending across a bunch of different federal agencies. So it seems like this is part of a bigger kind of philosophy about the size and role of government.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of what people think, the report actually brings up this new Fox News poll, which found that a pretty big chunk of registered voters, 65%, believe that there hasn't been enough planning in making these kinds of cuts. So it seems like there are a lot of people who are worried about whether all of this has really been thought through.
That's huge. I mean, 65%, that's a pretty clear sign that people aren't necessarily against the idea of making government more efficient, but they're concerned about how it's being done.
Yeah, and the report gives a little snapshot of where the president stands on other issues too, like border security, for example. He's got a 56% approval rating on that. But when you look at the economy and inflation, those numbers are pretty much flipped. So it's good to have that kind of background in mind.
Yeah, because everything's connected, right? So how people feel about these other issues could definitely affect how they see this whole Department of Education thing.
Exactly, exactly. Now, okay, I bet you're wondering this. Like, how much power does the president actually have to change the Department of Education without Congress actually signing off on it?
That's a good question.
Well, the report addresses that. It says that while Congress is the one that can officially get rid of the department, the president can definitely gut it and really slash the number of people who work there. So he can't make it legally disappear, but he can make it a lot smaller and a lot weaker.
Right. So there's a difference between getting rid of something completely and just making it not function very well.
Yeah, exactly.
And, that probably means big budget cuts, fewer staff. Maybe the department just won't be able to do as much as it used to. And that could mean that things slow down, fewer resources for schools, things like that.
Yeah, and the report also points out that doing that, making those kind of big changes, would almost certainly lead to a bunch of legal challenges.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Which is kind of where we get to this really interesting part that the report brings up, like the idea that the courts might actually push back against some of this.
Oh, really?
They even use the term constitutional crisis, which is a pretty loaded term.
Yeah.
Apparently, there have been quite a few disagreements between President Trump and federal judges, and this whole thing with the Department of Education could just make that worse.
That makes sense. I mean, if the president is trying to do something that some judges think is unconstitutional, they're going to try to stop him.
Right. And then you have this question of, well, what happens if the president just ignores what the judges say? The report actually uses this analogy that I thought was pretty funny, but also kind of scary. They basically say, well, what are the judges going to do? It's kind of like you and what army?
That's a good point.
Because at the end of the day, it's the executive branch, the president's branch, that's responsible for actually enforcing the law, including court decisions.
Right. So if he doesn't want to do something, it's hard to force him.
Yeah. And the report highlights this one really specific point of disagreement, which is the power of district judges to issue these really sweeping rulings. The administration apparently really doesn't like this, and to make it even more complicated, the Supreme Court hasn't really given clear guidance on how much power district judges actually have in these situations.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a lot of potential for conflict between the different parts of the government.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try to sum up everything for you. Basically, this executive order is a big signal that President Trump is serious about making good on this campaign promise to shrink the Department of Education. He wants to make it much, much smaller and weaker. But there are some big roadblocks in his way, mainly Congress. They would have to formally get rid of the department, and right now that doesn't seem very likely. And then you've got the courts, which might try to block some of the president's moves. So what does this all mean for schools and students? Well, that's the big question.
Exactly. And for all of you listening, think about this. A lot of schools rely on federal programs for funding, and millions of people have student loans. So even if the Department of Education doesn't disappear completely, just changing how it works or making it smaller could have some really big long-term effects. We're talking about potentially huge shifts in how education is funded and managed in this country.
Yeah, and that's something that we're going to have to keep watching very closely.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning of the story.
Definitely just the beginning. All right, well, that's it for a deep dive today. Until next time.